Hello, everybody, and welcome to another solo edition of the show. Unfortunately, we got pretty busy. Joey starting up a new job, but did not want to leave you all hanging. So here I am back again with some more Broncos takeaways and news and whatnot in the slower part of the offseason. But we're getting some Broncos action starting back up here, OTAs and whatnot. Media had the second day of the OTA period this week where they were allowed to attend practice. Sean Payton has, only allowed people to attend the minimum amount of days, the minimum allotted amount of time. I'm sure when the media is there, they're probably primarily stretching and doing other activities that aren't tipping their hand in any way, shape, or form, as has been typical with the Sean Payton regime over the last 3 years they're here. I was there for the Vic Fangio days and whatnot, and I thought he was trying to do his best to obstruct the media, having players line up in between sight lines in the field of play and whatnot. But Sean Payton is on a whole nother level. So that's been really interesting, I think, and will probably remain so. But in spite of that, in spite of the covert operations, we do have, I think, some pretty interesting takeaways from this week of Broncos OTAs, and then just some from around the NFL media landscape. Bree would want me to comment on how the Aaron Rodgers signing in Pittsburgh is probably going to go terrible, but keeping it Broncos focused, PFF is saying that PS2 is the second best cornerback in the NFL entering this upcoming season, behind Broncos country's much hated Sauce Gardner of the New York Jets. And the PFF rankings can always have some funky things here and there in them. This is a really odd one to me. Really, there's a lot of funky details in the top 10 in general. You've got Derek Stingley at 5. I would have Stingley 2. I think he should be no lower than 3. He's all the way down at 5. DJ Reed up at 6 is pretty shocking. Jair Alexander, given his predicament, at 9. I don't know how you can quite justify, like, that's ahead of Denzel Ward. That doesn't quite make sense to me. Jamel Dean at 17 feels a little rich, but getting down the Darius Slay at 21, just noticed that one. That's wild at his current age. But Surtain being at number 2 behind Sauce Gardner is the one everyone's going to cling to. I have their justification right here. They really don't dive into the two against each other. Their justification for Sauce is he has the highest coverage grade, PFF coverage grade of anyone. And he's forced a league high 46 incompletions and allowed a league low 0.6 yards per cover snap and 21.4% first down plus rate over this 3-year span. So a lot of it is being justified by the fact they're looking at this 3-year span and Pat Surtain and the rest of the Broncos defense having that terrible start to the 2023 season is kind of dragging everything down. Because you look at Surtain, the reigning defensive player of the year. I feel like that should maybe be a hint to the ranker. Again, that's happened 3 times in the last 30 years. What Surtain just did is one of the greatest cornerback seasons ever. Especially because he did it in a way that, Charles Woodson and Deion Sanders weren't doing it. He was doing it not with he wasn't doing it with sacks and these extra statistics in different categories. He was doing it just as like a lockdown cover guy. Stephon Gilmore is like the only comparable example, in the last several decades where we've seen a corner win the award with that sort of resume or that sort of campaign. So it just goes to show how amazing of a coverage player he was. I'm shocked he's at 2. And again, here's how they justify it. He's recorded a 89.5 coverage grade over the past 3 seasons, ranking second among cornerbacks, and his PFF advanced coverage grade places 3rd. Often asked to shadow the opposing team's top wide receiver, Surtain has produced at an elite level as he's allowed just 0.77 yards per coverage snap over the past 3 years. And that is worse than Sauce. But as they point out themselves, Sauce is just playing on one side of the defense. Surtain is tracking that best player all over the field, even into the slot sometimes, where that best player is going to have a two-way go against him. And not only does the receiver get that advantage, but Surtain's now having to play one hand behind his back because he's most comfortable on the boundary. So it's yeah, I don't, I just, to me, I think this year cemented that Surtain is the dude, the number one guy. And I remember last offseason, football minds that I really respect, I know maybe might be a little less popular in Broncos country, but Nate Tice, Deontay Lee, jump out. I'm trying to think who else. Who's the big cornerback guy? Escaping me. I think it was Deontay Lee. Yeah, Nate Tice, Deontay Lee, talking about how, oh man, it's a real coin flip between those two guys at cornerback. You know, they're both so great. You know, one guy's better in these different areas, the other guy's better in these different areas. It's pick your poison, really. I think they even might have leaned a little Sauce last year. And that was typical of all the shows I listened to. Not necessarily picking Sauce, but kind of that, ooh, these are the top two. Clearly, I don't know between these two. This offseason, and this is helped by the fact that Sauce just had a bad year while Surtain had this legendary season. But it's been, okay, yeah, Surtain's the best cornerback. No, yeah, Surtain's the best corner. It hasn't even been a point of debate. The only time I've even heard it, and not even debated, but it's like maybe Stingley can also be in that same tier of elite corner play. And I think he could. But right now, yeah, saying anyone's going to pass Surtain, I think is a little richer, or has already passed him. Coming off the season, we just saw, especially again when Sauce Gardner was bad, it wasn't just like, well, Sauce was also a first-team All-Pro. Sauce had the worst year of his career. Surtain had the best year we've seen from a cornerback in a long time. Still not enough. Wild to me. And I think wild to PFF too, considering this screenshot. Look, I mean, most valuable non-quarterback in 2024 for PFF WAR, Pat Surtain. They made a whole graphic about it. They tweeted it out the same day or the day after they put these cornerback rankings out. I feel like these things, you know, the Defensive Player of the Year award, the in your own in-house metric, is saying this guy is not only the best cornerback, he's the most valuable guy who doesn't play the quarterback position in the entire sport. You know, I think that should be enough for you to be like, yeah, he's the number one guy at his position. Especially if you're going to, because the crux of the argument favoring Sauce is the coverage grade, PFF's coverage grade, their in-house analytic. Okay, what about your other in-house analytic? That's saying Surtain is far superior to the other guy. It's not like Sauce is number 2 in this metric, right? Among all non-quarterbacks. I bet he's in the 20s, if that. And in 2024, he might be in the hundreds. So yeah, that one is pretty wild to me, admittedly. Don't get that at all. Wanted to open it up with that little rant. I imagine we can all get fairly upset with that. Appreciate y'all for jumping in the chat, supporting the show. It means a lot when I'm solo like this. Any likes help. Subscribe if you enjoy it. I think I might start doing these more regularly just because they're more fun. Or it's fun to, you know, just get on mic, talk Broncos with y'all. And, you know, I think I can keep the solo thing running. So want to get Joey and Bree on here as much as possible. I think they'll be back on with me a week from today. But until then, between now and then, maybe I'll hop on during the week here and there, cover some news as it develops. Keep this show rolling. Next bit of news for us here. I want to talk about Sean Payton's Jahdae Barron comments. Shout out, by the way, really quick. I'm going to play this clip from Luca Evans at the Denver Post. Excuse me. He's been doing amazing work. New to the beat, and that's a hard spot to be in. He joined the beat during the offseason, or maybe at the very end of last season, but either way, joined it at a hard time to join things. You know, you're thrown into the deep end. And I think he has immediately cemented himself as one of the best on that beat. Another young guy in journalism too. The young guys I think don't always get the benefit of the doubt, have to earn their stripes. I and certainly some fairness to that. But Luca Evans, support him. Make sure you're following him on Twitter or wherever else. I've been so impressed by his work. Great coverage. I think he's asking great questions at the press conferences. Yeah. So and providing us with great clips like this one on Twitter, where Sean Payton was asked about Jahdae Barron, and this is what he had to say. Oh, shoot. Sorry, everybody. I have to screen share this. I forgot. We had a glitch in the system when I was trying to convert it over. So this is what Sean Payton had to say about Jahdae.
Extremely smart. Play both Texas. His instincts real high. So you can give him more than some other younger player. Some guys might say, hey, let's just leave him before we do. He's one of those players that can handle potentially play safety as well. I don't have the same vision that I did for Malcolm. Malcolm came in 09, played nickel, and then went to safety. I see now. I'm not saying he could in a pinch, but the vision for him is gone, inside and outside.
Sorry for the technical problems there. I hope it was loud enough. He obviously had something going on with his throat, little hoarse voice there. But the quote didn't translate well to paper, so wanted to play the clip for you there. And I think there were a few things that stood out to me as noteworthy or interesting. One, the praise for Barron. Coach speak and hyping up rookies and everything, I do think is kind of commonplace this time of year. But Sean Payton, outside of Bo Nix, has really never been the type of guy to laud young players or really heap praise on them or hype them up. Bo Nix was talking about, and he's harsh even on Bo Nix. Bo Nix was talking about in one of his first pressers of OTAs how people inside the locker room have been telling them, hey, you haven't done anything yet. You haven't done anything yet. Don't get full of yourself though. You've got a lot to do. You haven't accomplished a darn thing yet. Right. That's Sean Payton. Right. That's Sean Payton. That's being referenced there as the someone inside the locker room. So he can be absolutely harsh on the young guys as a form of tough love. I think that's what's happening here with, or not what's happening here, but I think that underlines what's happening here with Jahdae Barron, how high this front office, this coaching staff must be on the kid. And, that's to no surprise how quickly he's mastering the defense, how he's impressing the staff so early. I think anyone who heard his post-draft comments talking about his mom, and how much he loves the game of football, how committed he is to it, his mental preparedness, all that stuff just really jumped off the screen in those interviews. So I think, that's not surprising, but always good to hear. It's still staying on the right track as they start getting practice rolling here. I think the other more interesting part is that he said the plan and vision for him is specifically at cornerback, really push down the idea of him playing much safety. Did mention that we could see him play inside and outside, but doesn't think he'll be playing safety. Could in a pinch. Again, he said that as a result of injury, and maybe that does happen if they deal with a rash of injuries at the position. But I think, yeah, we can expect he's probably going to be falling into that McDuffie role. And so shout out to Joey for calling that darn near from the jump. That, hey, he's probably going to be inside in nickel defense, but he's going to challenge Riley Moss as well for those outside snaps. I think that outside part of the quote is really interesting because Moss played well enough last year where you could kind of give him that starting job. Coaches are always going to preach competition, but some guys kind of have their jobs locked up going into camp. That shouldn't surprise people. And Moss, down the stretch, it was rough. So that probably opened the door. But for much of that season, he played well enough where you wouldn't have to consider benching him before week one. Not benching, but, in those base defensive looks. Now it feels like that's very much a possibility. And I think that is fascinating. What does this cause any drama behind the scenes? And what does that cornerback rotation ultimately end up looking like? Is it, maybe he's solely on the outside and McMillan stays on the inside all the time. I doubt that, but maybe that's how it ultimately plays out. And it's Moss who's really drawing the short end of the short straw here. Is it kind of what everyone's expecting, where Barron's in the nickel and then, outside on other downs where both guys are kind of hurting? Or is he just stealing those nickel snaps and Riley Moss will be able to hold him off on the outside? I'm going to be basic. I think Barron is going to get those outside looks in base defense. He's going to get in the nickel on those nickel defense looks or dime defense looks. You'll get McMillan on the field 2 and dime. That, to me, I think makes the most sense. And it's good to have that depth at corner. I think it makes sense to make sure he's fully versatile at everything. So if Moss suffers an injury, or Surtain or McMillan, whoever it might be, he's able to plug in. And, having those 3 strong corners, you should be able to, keep that defense on the tracks. And I think that's going to be really important with this being a defense-first team. Talking about how the defensive back room might shake out, I want to mention next week, I think we're going to get into some early projected starters, how we might see this Broncos roster shaping out. So I thought it'd be fun to maybe give a little preview of that with this cornerback talk. And now some wide receiver talk. I'm going to grab some water quick. 1 second. Now, one of the unanimous observations from camp has been that Devon Villay has been remarkably impressive, maybe the best receiver on the field. And I think that's raised some questions about what is this room going to look like in 2025? First off, with Devon Villay, could he, if he's the best receiver on the field, which again, maybe it seems to be that way in OTAs right now, do you need to keep Sutton around? Maybe you could trade him for a draft pick and, let him a win-win. He gets a contract extension from some team, the extension he's really looking for. Broncos get to save some money. And if they're right on Villay, they get to keep rolling, keep that offense clicking without skipping a beat, hopefully. I ultimately think Sutton's going to be fine. Bo Nix is the franchise. Sean Payton, I know I was just talking about him being harsh on Bo, and I think he has been at times. He loves Bo Nix so much. It's very obvious. I think he will move heaven and earth to make Nix work out. And I would imagine he believes in the premise of a receiver like Sutton helping, especially a veteran receiver like Sutton, Peyton himself being a guy who struggles to trust inexperienced players. That Sutton's going to get that he could see the value of Sutton and want to keep Sutton around and make sure he gets, is the primary target in this offense once again. And I think that's probably how it shakes out. I wouldn't be stunned if he was traded, but I'd be pretty surprised. At this point in the offseason, you look historically at what those type of trades garner. The Broncos would be pretty lucky to walk away with a third. I think it's probably more like a 4th or a 5th. Like a 4th would be a win for the Broncos, maybe even. And is that worth it for you? I would argue no. I think you can probably get a comp pick. Now, granted, maybe the Broncos spend enough that it doesn't matter in the formula, but there's a good chance the Broncos get a comp pick out of Sutton's departure. So, I mean, you're getting a guaranteed pick, which is something. You're probably getting it a year earlier, which is something. Maybe even a round earlier, which is something. But all that for, taking away your quarterback's number one favorite weapon, at least for now, favorite target, most reliable target, at least last time we saw him. That just doesn't seem like a good trade to me. And I don't think it'll seem that way to Peyton either. I think Sutton is more valuable to whoever has him. I don't think a team would want to give up a lot of capital for him because it is just a 1-year proposition. If you give up too much capital, you're going to be putting yourself in a really bad leverage position for that contract extension negotiation. So I don't think he's going to get much in a trade. And I think the Broncos, to justify a trade, would need quite a good bit. So I think they stand pat there. But could Villay solidify himself as the number 2 in this offense? I think he really could. Sutton is the X receiver in this offense. But as has been talked about a lot over these past couple of years, Sean Payton loves his oversized slot receivers. That, I think, is where Villay fits into this offense. And I think he is going to be heavily, heavily targeted. I think he's going to emerge as the number 2 target in this offense. I actually have a little receiver rotation breakdown and target share breakdown I did right before this. I'll share it with you guys. See what you think. Sutton at X, easy for me. Villay at slot, easy for me. Then I think Mims is going to start too. He's been better in the slot. That's where this all gets a little tricky. But I do think the Z ability is there. I think he got his feet under him some down the stretch last season. I think maybe he takes another step this season and locks down that Z spot for now, at least. I think Bryant will be that first guy off the bench. He had some of that power slot ability. We know how much Peyton likes that. I think that's going to benefit him. He's going to be a great blocker. Great red zone threat. I think he'll be that first guy. I actually think Sherfield, this probably surprises people, I think Sherfield's going to be that 5th guy ahead of Franklin because he can block ultimately, and because I think he's just a little more reliable. I think Sean Payton's going to trust him, to be in the right place at the right time more, to be more sure-handed, even though he had some drops during OTA, so maybe not. And then he's a dramatically better blocker. Franklin is a huge liability as a blocker, and Trent Sherfield is a pretty solid above average blocker for the position. So I know I do think they'll keep 6, but I think, we might be coming out of preseason. You might be coming out of preseason going, ooh, Troy Franklin's in some trouble. Now, target share, because that's going to go beyond just receivers. Here's how I think it'll break down. And I used last year's target numbers kind of as a baseline. I think we're going to see them pass the ball a little bit more just because I think the drives are going to be sustained longer, so they'll have more offensive plays overall. I think Sutton's going to have about 140 targets. That's pretty much what he had last year, slightly more. And I think that's about right. It's hard for me to imagine, considering the other bodies they added, that he's going to get funneled way more targets than he had last season. But I also don't know who's going to be gobbling up a bunch of his looks. Even Villay or Mims, unless they take some pretty large leap, again, towards being like a top 40 receiver in the league, which there's a lot of good receivers now, and both those guys are a ways off of that point. I don't know how much they're going to be able to eat into that total. Pat Bryant off the bench, I don't know how much he's going to eat into that total. So I think Sutton comes out at about 140. Villay, I do think will be the second most targeted guy at 85. It's a big step up from 55. But I think that has more to do with chemistry with Bo Nix. They've now played a whole season together. They'll be their connection will be more like it was at the end of last season than at the start of last season. To that point, Valet won't be having to earn playing time early on in the season. He's going to be, he's going to have the inside track, I guess, to receiving that playing time. And he also missed time last year with an injury, especially early in the season, which exacerbated that slow ramp up. So really, mainly, that's where I think the 30 targets will come from. Ultimately, around 5 targets a game, I think is about right. Mims, I think is going to be at 80. He was in a very similar boat last season in terms of targets. Let me see the exact number here. He had 50 targets last year, but if you'll remember, he only started 2 games in part because they had him on the bench for so long to start the season. He got hot down the stretch and was touching the ball, about 5 times, a little more than that per game. I think his touches might get eaten to some, and he's the explosives guy. But I think about 4 or 5 feels right again, because if the Broncos want, an easy wide receiver screen, and Sean Payton really loves those plays, they're going to look for Marvin Mims on those. So I think he's going to have a lot of work next season too. 4th, I think I have my first non-receiver. Oh, shoot. Wait. Mims I have at 75. Sorry. So Mims I have 4th at 75. RJ Harvey, I have as my 3rd most targeted guy at 80. Javonte Williams was the 2nd most targeted Bronco last season. And I think that gets spread around, but he had a lot of targets last year. The running back room in general, you had McLaughlin with about 30, and then the rest of the running backs with about 10 on top of that. So as a whole, they had about 110 targets. I think Harvey takes the lion's share of those, and I think there'll be a similar amount ultimately, because it was a bit of a safety blanket for Bo Nix last year that he leaned on a little too much, and I think that will improve. But I think it'll be designed more, or something you're incentivized to look for more. He'll look for it out of desperation less. I think he'll look for it out of design more, because Harvey's going to be able to do something with the ball in a sense that Javonte or really even Jahleel weren't. So I think, and I could be wrong, because maybe the pass protection thing, he's out there way less, and maybe he's closer to 50, and Dobbins is at 40, and McLaughlin's at 30. Maybe it ends up being more like that. I think Harvey ends up being the 3rd most targeted player in this offense, though. Then Mims, then Ingram. I think those top 5, and then there's a big teardrop to 6, and then a big teardrop after that to 7. Ingram, I think, will be right in that Mims Harvey neighborhood, a little below. I think around 70 targets feels right, and maybe I'm low on that. It's just, and I need to bump him up and take a little away from everyone else. I already did that. My first edit was, okay, I've got to bump Ingram's up, knock everyone else down a little bit. But I still wonder, am I too low? Because he could be a huge volume target. We just haven't seen the tight ends used much here in Sean Payton's Denver tenure, because they haven't had any good tight ends. So it's just hard, I think, to project how large that role will truly be. Last one here, I think, with a meaningful target share will be Pat Bryant. I think he'll have around 50 targets. That's what Troy Franklin had last year. I think they have more answers among their receivers, which is going to make it harder to get on the field. But I think Pat Bryant he's already been more impressive. And I think he's going to stay on that path. And I think he's, also being that power slot X archetype that Peyton loves so much. I think he's going to have greater success at earning that playing time. I think it's just going to be, there's going to be a lot more competition for it. And so those will ultimately even out, and he lands around 50 targets. I think everyone else finishes with about 70 targets combined. Distribute them how you want. I was struggling with how to do that myself, but I figured there's probably about 70, 80 left over. And that seems about right to me, between, Troutman, Sherfield, Franklin, Adkins, Estime, McLaughlin. There's probably around that amount there. Well, hope you guys enjoyed this brief little solo show. Wanted to touch on some of those big notes from this week in OTAs. We've got mini camp ramping up here shortly. We'll have the whole gang back next week to do some projected starters for you guys. Until no, I'll be set up by Sunday. Until next time, everybody, let's go Broncos.